In this module, we're going to be looking at generative AI and security, right? And what I've actually done is I've actually put a multi-part course together, which kind of explores this exact topic, right? So in today's module, really what we're going to do is we're just going to try to introduce the syllabus, like the agenda, the contents, or what this multi-stage course is going to consist of. And when we look at generative AI and security, there's a lot. And now the problem here is in order to do security on generative AI, is you need to know generative AI to a sufficient level before we can start practicing security around it, right? And that's similar to, for example, cloud security, right? So in order to be able to do security in cloud, you need to know about cloud like Google Cloud, AWS, Azure, etc. And generative AI is no different, right? So within this course, what we're going to do essentially is we're going to be looking at artificial intelligence, right? We're going to be looking at machine learning. We're going to look at model types and deep learning, right? So these are the kind of like, consider these as the four pillars of traditional domain of that kind of world that exists right now, right? And then what we're obviously going to look at is generative AI and generative AI applications, right? Now, when we look at these kind of like area domain, right, we also need to look at in terms of content types, right? So there's a lot of content here, right? And there's policies involved, and obviously one would expect classes of machine learning models, right? Now, there is a key concept here, and we're going to get to it, which is called supervised learning and unsupervised learning. Like, what is that, right? And what is the difference between the two, right? Another traditional pillar of this kind of community is really neural networks. So we'll do a little bit of a deep dive in neural networks, but not too much. And really all this, right, AI, ML, generative AI, everything is all about data processing. There's a lot of data involved, right? And we're also going to be looking at decision making. What does that entail? How do you do decision making in this kind of like generative AI field? We're going to be looking at labeled and unlabeled data. Again, going back to that consistent theme about data itself, right? Within this domain, there's a lot of layers. And when I talk about layers, I'm thinking in terms of input and output, right? What are we inputting into the system here? What are we getting out of it, right? And one of the buzzwords that generative AI is associated with is large language models, right? So imagine, if Gen AI was the table, the legs of the table would be the large language models. That is what that essentially, that core functionality is, right? We're going to be looking at discriminative versus generative, right? Obviously, our emphasis is on non-later. That's what we want to focus on more. But how does that compare to discriminative, right? Another aspect that we're going to be looking at is patterns, right? So there's a lot of patterns, right? How do we, because there's data, we want to extract patterns. What are those kind of patterns? And we're going to look at that as well, right? And if you think about just AI, machine learning, that kind of field, Gen AI, there's a lot of maths involved in it. And in many ways, if you think about how you get into this area, is you do need to have a solid mathematical background, right? So we're not going to suddenly become mathematic experts within this course, but we're going to know sufficiently maths at a level that is required in order to understand generative AI and in order to be able to apply security to it, right? So that's why I put X and Y, right? So we're going to understand, what is X, what is Y, what is the difference between the two. So we'll do a sufficient deep dive around that, okay? We're still not done with AI, ML, Gen AI, right? There's a lot more content still involved, right? So there's data sets, distribution, probability and distribution. Again, we're looking at the statistical aspects of it, training actually on the data. We're going to be looking at content generation because really the end goal of Gen AI is to produce content, right? What is that content, right? We're going to look at predictive ML models, traditional ML models. What is the difference between the two? We're going to be comparing data versus labels. And also we're going to be looking at text, images, audio, natural language speech, some of the outputs of Gen AI, right? Now, again, we talked about on the previous slide about maths, right? So we're still going to look at maths in a little bit more detail, but we're going to look in terms of the context of programming, right? So, like I said before, maths is a very important element of this kind of community, and even more so is programming. And again, we don't want to become programming experts, but if you have a software development background, it does certainly help, right? So when I talk about X, Y, X, and F, etc., I'm thinking in terms of programming, like if then else statements, loop statements, object oriented programming, Python coding, classes, etc., right? So we'll look into some of those in a little bit detail. We're going to look at M and MDA. We're going to look at PALM, PALMs, and we're going to look at in terms of the actual platforms, right? So we have OpenAI, Google. We're going to be looking at a lot of elements of statistical models, and we're going to be looking at data structures, generative language models. We're going to be looking at generative image models. What is the difference of those different types of models? Pattern matching and transformer models. And I'm just going to say at this stage here, right? Transformer is, it's an important word. Again, it kind of goes back into that buzzword kind of word here, but it is important, and we're going to understand in the context of this community what does that actually mean, right? And we're going to be looking at encoders, decoders. We're going to look at flow charts, how we move that data in there, how does it actually work. And by now you're probably thinking here, what about the security topics? And you're right, we haven't even got to the security topics. And again, you really can't do security in this community of AI, ML, Gen AI, and that kind of stuff without knowing this domain pretty well, right? And when you understand this domain, you yourself will actually begin to understand where that security needs to be applied, right? So, we talked about in this kind of community, we need to understand what transformers are, hallucinations. So think about this moment, hallucinations are exactly what the name states, right? It's not technically something that's true. I think of false positives and things like that, right? So we're going to be looking at number factors. We're going to look at valid versus incorrect. We're going to be looking at prompts, right? So prompts is really what you enter at the command line. We're going to look at prompt designs, prompt input versus output, back end versus front end. A lot of models. We're going to be looking at model types, and then we're going to be looking at, when we look at Gen AI in specific, right? We're going to be looking at things like text to image, text to video, text to talk, ChatGPT, Google's version, Bard. So we're going to go into that a little bit more deeper, and obviously we're going to put a spin on this, which is the focus, the lens to which we're going to be looking at generative AI and security is going to be mainly focused on Google Cloud, right? We'll briefly touch on AWS and Azure, but where do we do this essentially? Where are we applying our practice, our trade, right? And we're going to be doing that in Google Cloud. We're going to be looking at some of these products called Palm API, Maker Suite, Gen AI Studios, and Generative AI App Builder, right? Again, in the context of Google Bard, right? That is essentially what it's competing against OpenAI's ChatGPT, right? So now that there's a lot of topics there, we're going to get to that. So once we understand generative AI and all the elements of that community, then we will move over to the security community and kind of like focus on how are we now going to be doing security. So from there is really almost downhill, right? So we've done most of the work. So I feel, the previous slides in terms of content is really the uphill, right? You're going to feel a little bit more challenging. The content moves at a fast rate, and there's a lot there, right? And then after that, you become familiar with security as you're coming down that hill, right? And immediately when you look at the slide, there's a lot of stuff that you're already familiar with, right? Things like control, access, identity access management, cloud security, things like security standards, right? The tools, the platforms, right? And then there's actually some security elements that are perhaps new, something that Gen I brings to the table here, right? But all we see those traditional pillars there already, right? So we're building on the security of what we already know, right? And I think if we're building Gen AI solutions, no conversation would be without secure software development life cycles, right? SDLC, right? So we're going to be looking at that. We're going to be looking at governance, risk, and compliance. That's very important. That's an important layer to Gen AI. And also the laws. Are there any laws right now? What are the thoughts around that, right? Some of the conversation is going to be interesting in this area because it's not well defined, right? Remember, Gen AI is a relatively new domain, right? And there are some things we can traditionally apply from the security community, but then there's some we have to come up with. Is there new kind of securities here, right? So that's what the slide is kind of doing. And again, we have that common stuff, right? Encryption at rest, encryption in transit, perhaps encryption in use. Okay, so we'll look into that as well, right? And I'm going to leave it there. So there is a tremendous amount of content, but we're going to dive into each of these topics. And by the end of the course, right, you'll know sufficiently well what Gen AI is, and then you can easily apply security to it. Thank you very much.